Okay. Thank you so much for taking the time today. My name is Scott P. Gill. This is RW 721 through 724 academic presentation. And I have chosen the topic for this presentation, examining the role of religious liberalism in shaping social reform in America between the Second Great Awakening and the Civil Rights Movement. Okay? And so that is the title of the presentation. Again, thank you for taking a moment to check it out. So the first part that we wanted to discuss, what is religious liberalism, right? So what is it that we're actually discussing in broad terms here? So in broad terms, religious liberalism, also commonly referred to as modernism, is a process by which traditional Christian teachings are interpreted through the spectrum of more modern social values and norms. And so we'll definitely dig farther and farther as we go through this presentation into kind of how that's impacted not just the way we see things now, but some of the major events in our nation's history. And so the way that I look at this as I begin to look into this topic is it's kind of the intersection of religious values and modern cultural norms, right? So we have our kind of Christian fundamental values that we have, but then we also live in a constantly evolving and changing society. And so how do we evaluate or kind of rectify those two things together? And that's kind of what we want to talk about here today. All right. And so the period that we're primarily focused on for this particular exercise, we want to look at how American society has changed between the mid 1800s and then up to about 1970, towards the end of the Civil Rights Movement. Okay. And so that's the period of time that we are covering in this particular presentation. All right. As a part of this exercise, we'll be looking at some key historical events. We'll be looking at some dates. We'll be looking at some key historical figures. And hopefully the way that we evaluate those things will help us bring context to the overall thesis of this assignment. Okay. And then ultimately, what I think that we'll have the opportunity to take from this is, how is our Christian worldview, right? How are we as Christians to view the world, right, through the lens of our social existence, right? Or, as things change in the world around us, how does that change, if at all, the way that we view our Christian ideology? Okay. And so basically we want to look at this period specifically from the evangelicalism of the Second Great Awakening. Okay. Again, talking mid 1800s or so up to and through the 1960s. We'll talk a little bit about the Black church. You really can't talk about the Civil Rights Movement without talking about the Black church in America. Okay. So let's talk about the Second Great Awakening. The Second Great Awakening was a period in American history described as a Protestant revivalist period during the early 19th century. Okay, and so we're talking 1800s here. What the Second Great Awakening was kind of built on was an effort to look outwardly into society to spread the gospel. Okay. And so there were a lot of changes that were going on in the 1800s in the United States. And as a part of those changes, Christian leaders saw the need to get out, right, among the people to spread the gospel. And as we start to look at some of the different notable figures of the Second Great Awakening, we'll see that there were some different motives. People had different reasons that they wanted to do that. But ultimately, this was the core of the Second Great Awakening. Okay. A lot of the evangelicalism of that movement was surrounded by the encouragement of a personal relationship with Christ. Okay, and so while there were tons of fundamental principles that were already in place through Christianity, the revivalism of the movement really encouraged each individual to kind of seek within themselves and develop their own personal relationship with Christ. We also saw this period as kind of the merging of Christian ideals in American society. Okay, so, again, a lot of changes going on. We'll talk more in detail about those changes throughout America. How are we as Christians in the 1800s going to make sure that our Christian ideals and the way that we fundamentally believe that things should be based on our faith are properly integrated into American society. Okay. This was a very significant period in that it brought about the rise of numerous Christian institutions, colleges and seminaries and social organizations that still survive today, were brought about as a result of the Second Great Awakening. Then we also want to talk about urbanization, right? And the shift that we saw during the period from rural to more urban areas, or the thrive of urban areas, and the types of opportunities that this created for pastors and congregationalists to come and to speak to large crowds of individuals, okay, in order to spread the gospel. Okay. And so we'll start by taking a look at just a couple of notable figures. Charles Grandison Finney is one notable figure. He was a revivalist preacher in the New York area. And he was recognized as one of the founders, the early founders of revivalism. And so quite possibly through our studies here at Trinity, we've had the opportunity to study on that. He was an advocate for social reform, but through the church. And the reason I say through the church the way that I do is because we're going to talk a lot about different paths and means to social reform. And all of them haven't necessarily been structured so that the reform would actually take place through the church. And Charles Grandison Finney was a champion of social reform, but that reform needed to start with the church. Timothy Dwight was another notable figure that we will discuss. He traveled the northeastern United States and he would preach the gospel. He was more known for his urbanism, right? So he was more known for his quest to try to figure out how are we going to shift from rural to urban as a society, and what is that going to do to our faith, right? What is the rise of urban areas going to do to the Christian faith? And how is just that general shift, population, way of life, methods of travel, all of the things that come along with urbanization, how is that going to translate into us maintaining our position as a Christian society, right? And then James McGready is another figure that we want to talk about. He was more, whereas Dwight and Finney were northeastern type guys, McGready was more of a southern guy. He traveled the southern United States, and he looked more at the fundamental issues of the changes that he was noticing in society, social behaviors, right? Cursing and drinking and doing things that were sinful in nature, right? And so this was more his focus as he rose to notoriety through the Second Great Awakening. Okay. So let's talk about the politics of religious liberalism. So we know that there were a lot of major events, and we're going to talk about some major events and how they framed religious liberalism in America, or how they framed Christian life in America. The American Civil War is one event we want to talk about. That was from 1861 to 1865. Most folks know a lot about the Civil War. We're not going to go too deep into that. Everyone knows that Abraham Lincoln was president around that period. But one thing that I think that is very interesting that doesn't get discussed much is the concept of religious nationalism and how the Civil War contributed to that concept as a whole. In other words, while Lincoln was not known to be a religious figure, right, he did appeal to the nation's sense of what's right and what's wrong as a means by which to maintain the union during the Civil War. So we were fractured as a nation, we were split. Lincoln utilized just a general moral sense of what's right and what's wrong in a lot of his teachings and a lot of his speeches to try to maintain the unification of American society. And so from that sense, at that point, there began to be kind of this idea that there is a civil religion, right? So maybe not Christianity, or maybe not Catholicism or Protestantism, a focal point for a civil religion, a religion that's just basically an idea of what's right and what's wrong, okay? And so again, Abraham Lincoln, while not known as a religious figure, okay, this was a political tool that he used in order to kind of guide the nation through the Civil War. Okay, very interesting. Also, we could talk about Thomas Jefferson as another notable figure in the Declaration of Independence. Okay, and this occurred before the Civil War, but there were questions that came about as a result of the Civil War and slavery about what it really means to be free, right? And these questions really are at the core of kind of the conflict between fundamental Christian ideology and the behavior or the treatment of the slave populations. What does it mean to be free? And so Thomas Jefferson, of course, one of the forefathers of the nation, had drafted the Declaration of Independence. And now we had to take a step back and say, okay, what's the relationship between religious freedom and political freedom? So when we just look at that document alone, okay, it's a document about freedom, okay? But when we look at it in the context of the Civil War and we look at it in the context of slavery, we can see that there is a correlation between religious freedom and political freedom. All right, so you can't very well be free in one major aspect of human existence while not having freedom in another aspect. Okay, and so I think that these were a couple of items that came to play as it pertains to kind of the political realm during this time. All right, religion and the legacy of slavery, right, is what we kind of transition to when we take a look at the Civil War period, and we have to have an understanding that there were dueling perspectives, okay, during this particular time. When we talk about dueling perspectives, we talk about it from two different standpoints. From one standpoint is the perspective of the slave, and from the other standpoint, we take a look at the perspective of the slave owner. Okay, so from the perspective of the slave, Christianity by and large shaped a lot of the norms and values, right, of the African American population, both towards the end of slavery as well as after the emancipation of slaves. We see that Christianity served as the foundation of the Black church and, quite honestly, many other Black institutions that still exist today, Black schools, etc. Okay, and then also there was association with freedom, okay, with Christianity. Now, it's kind of ironic because a lot of historians have commented on how it was the intention of the slave owner to utilize Christianity to control the slaves. But what actually ended up happening was the Christian principles provided a catalyst for the movement to be free. Right? And so the association between Christianity and the freedom of slaves, okay, cuts to the very core of some of the things we see in the Black church today. Just the notion of freedom in Jesus Christ, just the notion of faith that a better day is coming, and the notion of forgiveness. From the perspective of the slave owner, there was a very contentious debate, right? Because you had slave owners and then you had non-slave owning whites, which were the majority of the country. Okay, and there were some moral implications in that debate, right? So, for instance, the torture of the slaves, right? Many people felt, many non-slave owning whites, and certainly I'm sure some slave owners as well, felt convicted by the sights and the smells and the scenes of the torture that the slaves were subjected to. And so there were moral implications there. Okay, and that conviction, right, at some point had to be seen as almost a communication from Christ that something wasn't right, right? A communication with God that something's not adding up here in terms of our Christian principles to love, right? And so there was an interesting perspective on behalf of the slave owner. And then also we saw during this period the use of biblical text to justify or refute the practices of slavery, right? So some folks would take the text and they would, utilize, certain elements of the text to say this portion of this particular text is clearly instructing us that we should not be treating this group of people in this way. And others would point to, more Old Testament theology that discusses the process of slavery as being a part of the natural social order. And so there were different interpretations of the biblical text that were being used to either justify or refute the practices of slavery. Okay. In terms of global conflict, we know that World War I was a period that we wanted to discuss here. 1914 to 1918. World War I was very interesting because this was the first major world conflict where the power of the weaponry really let everyone know how bad it could get, if you will. You know, the carnage, the sight of so many people being killed or slaughtered at one time by this powerful weaponry led to a pacifist movement. Okay, and so a lot of Christians of the time just really felt as if the First World War, right, was a sign that perhaps our violent tendencies had gotten a little bit out of control. Okay, this led to some questions surrounding the church's support of war. And one of the things that we'll discuss at a very high level, but we won't talk very long on today, is, you know, the concept of religious nationalism and religious liberalism, right? How do they come together? And so there were some questions that came about in terms of some of the rhetoric that was being used by the church at the time in support of the war. Okay. And a lot of that rhetoric was surrounding the principle or the spiritual discipline of prayer. Okay. So if you have Christians on opposing sides of a conflict, to what extent, when you pray, are you not leveraging that prayer, okay, as a means by which to petition God to be on your side, okay, as opposed to leveraging the prayer for peace as a whole? And so this came up and is cited as a point of contention among the Christian church at the time of the First World War. Is it right to pray for someone else's demise if that individual is a Christian in coordinates with your desire to win a war? Okay, very interesting. When we talk about World War II, okay, 1939 to 1945, World War II was unique because there was a realization in America that just we are not going to be able to keep our religion separate from our political nationalism. Okay, so our patriotism as a country, okay, in some way is going to have to tie back to our religion. Okay, a purely pacifist movement that's based on fundamental Christianity itself is not going to prevent a war. It did not prevent the First World War, and here we are in the Second War. And so now we have to take a step back and realize that we're not going to be able to maintain that separation the way that we had hoped. Okay. And again, pacifism is a general Christian principle, right? But pacifism on its own was not enough for the Christian church to prevent international or global conflict. Another interesting piece of what we saw in World War II was a shift in gender roles. Okay, so a changing contemporary view of women's roles in society as a whole. Okay, as many men, had to be displaced from their jobs or went off to war, many women came in and they stepped up and got into the workforce. And as women got into the workforce, the question, came about: what is our role in society? Women, no doubt, felt a higher level of independence, felt empowered. And that shift, all right, that change, all right, that cultural change had to be reconciled with the fundamental Christian values that many of the women grew up believing. So many women of the era grew up being taught fundamental Christian values, but those Christian values held women in subservient roles. So as women were socially and economically advancing in society, it was only natural that there be an opportunity for women to revisit to what extent they needed to be maintained in such subservient roles for the sake of fundamental Christian values. And that in itself is a phenomenon of modernism. Okay. So contribution of modernism to the civil rights movement. So the movement itself. Okay, so the civil rights movement in America is widely recognized as a period lasting roughly between 1954 and 1968, where African Americans struggled to end legalized racial discrimination and segregation. Okay, and so we've all heard of the civil rights movement, hopefully by this time. The impact of modernism cannot be overstated as it pertains to the civil rights movement. when you look at just where we've come already in this short presentation, from a period of slavery in America for African Americans, through a moral reckoning occurring by and large through the Christian church, to the civil rights movement, where there was actually a viable opportunity for African Americans to petition for institutionalized rights. Okay, that in itself is modernism. Okay, that process is religious liberalism. Okay, the Black church provided a mechanism for organization and for activism. Okay, so the Black church was huge. In fact, the Black church is widely recognized as one of the only institutions at one point in time in American history that Black people were allowed to have, was a church. And so this was the primary or the core organizational vehicle, if you will, by which Black people could get together. And what that ended up turning into was that ended up turning to a higher level of activism, so that what happened inside of the church could spill over into social and other areas of cultural life. Okay? Christianity as the great equalizer. And many times throughout American history, Christianity was the only thing that the majority of Black people and the majority of white people agreed upon. Everything else was a point of contention or was a great source of disagreement. But Christianity, by some scholars' accounts, has been seen as the great equalizer for the Black church. Challenges faced by modernism. Okay, so while modernism was and still is a huge factor in the advancement of Black people in America, there are certain challenges that were exposed during the civil rights period. In other words, everything that was going on in the Black community at that time wasn't good. Right, you saw the rise of kind of dance clubs, nightclubs, alcoholism in the Black community. You started to see the rise of a foul language, okay, and just some other things. The rise of divorce, right? Divorce became a thing that people started doing during this period. Quite a few things. Homosexuality was another area that fundamental Christian values were unable to be reconciled with. Okay, so there was this, while there was a great benefit of the Black church from a modernist movement, there were also some issues, okay, with some other cultural behaviors in the Black community that did not mesh with Christian principles. Okay, and then there was also this widespread understanding that there could be far-reaching consequences of Black transgressions. In other words, at a period of time in American history where Black people were fighting for equal rights, it doesn't create the message to white people, okay, if we have crime and if we have sinfulness in the way that we live, if we speak with a foul mouth and if we drink too much, things of those natures, those transgressions could serve to hurt the progress towards ending legalized racial discrimination. And so there was this understanding within the Black church that, while we are on this movement, there could be some pretty serious negative consequences if we do not allow our behavior to support our faith. Okay. And so what this did was this created some conflict within the Black community. Okay, because everyone in the Black community wasn't a Christian. And so there were some, such as your Malcolm X, Huey Newton, there were some, the Black Panther movement, that wanted to separate the civil justice part of the institutionalized marginalization that was occurring in America from the religious movement. Okay, so many said, look, whether we're Christians or not, it doesn't matter. Black people deserve equal rights. Whether we drink or not, or whether we smoke or not, or get divorced or not, none of that matters. Regardless of what the circumstances are, we deserve equal rights. And so many of those individuals actually took issue with the way that the Christian church always was focused on nonviolent movements, to the extent that it appeared as if the results weren't as fruitful as many felt that they should have been. And so there were lots of conflicts within the Black community surrounding the sources and methods of the Black church, which were by and large nonviolent, and the sources and methods or proposed sources and methods of those non-Christians in the Black community who were still demanding equal rights. So at the core of this too, right, was pushback from segregationists in the South. And so again, just like we saw during the Civil War period, where some were utilizing the biblical text as justification for maintaining slaves in bondage, we continue to see this through the Civil Rights period, particularly in the southern states, Mississippi, where many of those Christians, if you will, would utilize the biblical text as a rationale by which to maintain their segregationist views. Okay, so in conclusion, there's still a lot of questions that remain here, right? What does the church have to say to the people in modern society, right? So we see that there is a process by which religious liberalism is having a impact on Christianity. Christianity is having an impact on on the way that we view the world. There is a constant and consistent back and forth, dynamic and interconnected relationship, okay, between our social norms and values, the society that we live in, and our religious values, right? So we see that relationship exists. The question is now, what does the church have to say to people in modern society, in modern times, okay, that maintains the integrity of our faith, while at the same time recognizing the changes that are occurring in our society at large? And this is a big thing going on right now for the Christian church. Okay, how can we talk about God, the cross and resurrection, sin and forgiveness, mercy, love and justice in a theologically substantial and simultaneously existentially relevant way, right? How can we maintain, right, our core message, right, which is salvation through Jesus Christ? How can we maintain that core message, right, while at the same time having that message transition into something that's relevant for today's society? Okay, so this would be almost a process of leveraging and utilizing modernism, right, in a way that allows us to maximize the number of people that we're able to reach with the gospel. We have to ask ourselves, how much is too much, right? So when we consider the impact of our changing cultural values on the way we practice our religion, at what point are we compromising the core values of our religion for the sake of what's convenient with what's culturally popular, right? Popular culture, or whatever things are happening in the world, right? How do we be in the world but not of the world, but still have a positive impact on the world? And then at what point does our exegetical practices amount to syncretism? Okay, so at what point does our practice of biblical interpretation, right, taking the scriptures, right, and applying them to our daily lives, okay, at what point does that process amount to syncretism, or us taking the scriptures, okay, and simply making them say what we want them to say so that they fit within a larger cultural context, right? So on one hand, we're interpreting scriptures, and then on the other hand, we have the world outside. At some point, we're pulling the scriptures too far away from what they were intended to mean within the Christian context, and we're contextualizing them in a way that amounts to basically allowing it to be anything that we want it to be, or anything that we need it to be to suit our purposes at that time. And so this is a common question that we have to ask, and something that we have to pray and to stay in tune with our faith in order to make sure that we are in line with what God has for us. So yeah, so that's it. Thank you so much for your time today, and please be blessed. We'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.